Um, there we go. Yeah. So I need to pick up my train of thought now. That's fine. So yeah, I was thinking about reading Shakespeare because there's been a lot of publicity about generative AI and it replacing students' writing. And obviously, if you're a teacher in schools, you're seeing that the whole time anyway. But actually, how can we think more positively about how to use AI tools to help and support students' reading? So that's what I really wanted to look at. And if I just hang on. There we go. This comes within a context of a lot of the kind of educational activities that we do are very much based on some of the kind of active approaches to Shakespeare. I love an active approach to Shakespeare. I had my year 10 students up and kind of shouting insults at Juliet earlier as if they were her father. And I think it's fantastic. It offers so much in terms of student engagement. But as this kind of sort of suggests there are also some kind of slight issues with that. We love a bit of active approaches, rehearsal room pedagogy, and there's been some great studies on how that can really help students to engage with the text. But as pointed out by a recent article talking about the difficulties students have with the language, is it doesn't always address the text. And students can have a fantastic time, but there will still be words and phrases that they don't understand. And so I think we need a suite of activities. English is never just one approach. There is always a lot to be gained from lots of different activities. And I think perhaps AI tools can have a place and a role to play in thinking about that kind of focus on the language. So that's what I wanted to look at. Also perhaps something that is more easily accessible and always accessible than the kind of teacher as interpreter, which you sometimes kind of can get stuck on. So my context I talked a little bit about earlier, but I was particularly looking at a small mixed ability sample of about 34 year 10 pupils who were all studying Romeo and Juliet at GCSE level. Of that 34, 13 of them had an SEND diagnosis, mostly dyslexia or slow reading and processing skills. So this was kind of the mild to moderate learning difficulties range. It wasn't sort of really extreme, but certainly something that made Shakespeare for them more difficult to engage with. So that was my context. I did some questionnaires with them after a whole range of different activities, AI and non-AI, which were largely qualitative, some open-ended, some using kind of Likert scale, kind of getting them to rank what they find useful or whether they felt confident or less confident or more confident. And obviously it is a very small data set. So I feel like these are kind of indicative results that can give a bit of an insight, but obviously it wasn't a really large scale study. So having said that, my question was, how might AI support pupils' reading of Shakespeare? And by that, I was looking specifically at decoding vocabulary, but also reading comprehension of plot, character, and theme. I'm going to talk more about my second tool than my first tool, because I did look at two different tools. One of them was a Shakespeare translator, which is kind of was hosted on the Pickaxe site, and which is a no-code platform and is kind of powered by ChatGPT. I'm not going to talk a huge amount about that because I have actually written up that study for the spring edition of Teaching English. So get your copy from the English Association and you can read all about it there. So that's a bit of a plug. But the second sort of tool that I used was the Will Play application, which is really fun. If you haven't kind of encountered it yet, I know Becky's going to send around the web links and how to kind of access it later, but it is a really fun kind of chat your way through Shakespeare, which was designed by a computer games company in Oxford in conjunction with Oxford University, some academics there, and they were kind of I think they entered it into the Alter Narratives Nesta competition a few years back and came second. But it's a really fun kind of interactive based on Charisma AI chatbot of chatting your way through Romeo and Juliet. So that's the one that I'm really going to talk about today. I will briefly talk about the translator though, just to have a quick look at this word cloud that was generated from the pupil feedback about what they liked about the tool. And you can just see straight away that words like easy, clearer understanding, search it up, quick, simple, accurate, come up again and again and again. And I think what was interesting about that is that it was particularly popular with our SEND pupils. So I think there is a lot to be said for some of these AI translators. I'm going to just summarise briefly some of the positives before I move on to talk about the Will Play chatbot. So the first thing that came out, and particularly with the SEND pupils, was the accessibility of it. So it didn't require dictionary skills. It didn't require skimming or scanning or jumping from line to line or checking a glossary or following notes in a scholarly edition. Even if you think about something which is supposed to be more accessible, like functional skills, there is still an element of dictionary work or dictionary skills in some of the specifications, which are very, very difficult if you don't know how to spell the word and you find it difficult to look things up. So the kind of accessibility of a translator like this, I think, is really exciting. And with further development, you could have camera settings so that you don't even need to be typing stuff in or cutting and pasting. You can just take screenshots. So the accessibility was great. The second thing that came out from the research was the familiarity that students had with this kind of a product. So every single student that I surveyed had used machine translation in their modern foreign languages. So they were familiar with Google Translate, with Babbel. They used programs like Gorth to help them even with things like maths. So they were very, very familiar with the kind of interface and found it really kind of easy to use. But the thing that I found most interesting, and actually leads into the second AI tool, was the ability to interrogate the translator, to talk back to it. So this particular translator has 10 alternative phrasings built into it. So if you don't quite understand what it's telling you a phrase means, you can go back to it and say, I'm sorry, what does that mean? Or what does that mean? Or what does this word mean? And it will give you alternates, and you can kind of have that conversation with the translator. So it has that kind of chatbot interface that enables interrogation. And I think that's really exciting. And that's something that I wanted to look at in more detail when I looked at the next one. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. So there might be a little bit of pushback using chatbots to experience Shakespeare, but Felicity Brown and Rachel Hodge, who were two of the academics who designed it, were kind of pointing out, this is in one of their podcasts, that actually dialogue with Shakespeare is absolutely authentic and original, and audience members are always talking back in Shakespeare's theatre. And as Peter Brook says, theatre is a conversation and a dialogue between the performers and the audience. So why not have a chatbot enabling part of that conversation, part of that dialogue, which I think is quite fun. So this is what it looks like. That's quite a fun, cartoony interface. You can see there are kind of avatars. It has that kind of Instagram, social media kind of feeling to it. It's fun and it's colourful. And what I quite like about it is it's not photoreal, which I'll come back to a bit later. There are 3 sections that you play through and chat through. The first one is called love, the second is hate, and the third one is death, which probably sums up quite a lot of English literature, but works for Romeo and Juliet. And in the first section, you chat as yourself. So you can create your own avatar, you can have your own name, and you talk to Juliet. You basically act as her confidant as she talks you through the events of the first couple of acts of the play, and you kind of respond to that, which is quite fun. As it goes on and gets a bit darker, in the second section, you role play as Benvolio. So you are Benvolio and you talk to various characters, particularly some of the male characters, about what's going on as things get a bit more tense. And then the final section, Death, you are Friar Lawrence, which is not a great person to be because you're basically like, no, don't do that, don't do that. Oh no, this is terrible, it's all going horribly wrong. But it's quite fun as you follow how the plot develops. Now, the thing that's quite nice about this is it's a little bit like those choose your own adventure books that were super popular in like the 80s when I was a kid. Here's an example of sort of Balthazar chatting to Friar Lawrence at the end of the thing. So this is me here on the side with my little Friar Lawrence with his funky hairstyle. So you can kind of say things like, oh, sounds really boring, like Mantua sounds really boring, and kids do, and they kind of test it and see how far they can push it. But it kind of pulls you back on track. So there's an element of, the chat is, it's an AI powered chatbot and it will respond to what you say and it will make sense, but you're still within these guardrails of the plot as it kind of pootles along, which is quite nice. The other thing I like about it is, as well as it looking kind of reasonably contemporary and funky, it still uses the original text as well. So you can see at the bottom there on this particular conversation, I've said, oh, Mantua sounds boring. And Balthazar thought, yes, as Romeo would say, there is no world without Verona walls. So it kind of links it back to the original text, as well as kind of helping your comprehension of the story and the plot and the themes and stuff. The other thing that's really nice about it is it's quite user responsive. So in the earlier sections, when Juliet is chatting to the user, it sort of says, oh, some of the sort of the boys were making some really inappropriate comments. If you don't want to hear them, just say, I don't want to, and I'll move on. And so some of the content that's a little bit racy or a bit rude in Shakespeare that is there's an element of it responding to the user's preference. So if that's something that, you know, I have some students who are quite sort of sheltered and they perhaps don't want to hear that kind of thing, they would just say that and it would move on and it would respond to user preference. So that's quite a nice, as a teacher, quite a nice element as well. Okay, so moving on to how the students found the chatbot and what they thought about it. So again, I've got a little word cloud here, things that they liked about the chatbot, and I've just kind of broken that down really into 3 areas. So the most common set of responses was relating to reading comprehension. So words like story, storyline, understanding, learning, consolidation came up a lot in what they liked about the story, which kind of indicates that they felt, whether they did or not, but certainly their perception was that it really helped them with understanding what was going on. The second largest group of responses was things like fun, engaging, entertaining. But then the thing I found most interesting was the prevalence of words which kind of related to the dialogic nature of the chatbot itself. So a lot of these responses were kind of linked to conversation, explore, question and answer, interactive, talk to it. And they would often be kind of used in conjunction with the first 2 kind of comments that the students made. Now, I think that's really interesting because 73% of the students that I surveyed found that the chatbot had made them feel much more confident with the plot and the language after using it. And they're quite sophisticated users of AI. So another thing that I did when I kind of ran this with them, as well as other activities, was I asked them about their other experiences of AI. So the people who were really good with it tended to be the gamers, and they had very sophisticated, high expectations of how AI would respond. So sometimes they didn't like the fact that it was on those story rail tracks, but they kind of understood that within the world of Romeo and Juliet, as it would be within the world of FIFA Manager or whatever it is that they like the AI for. The other thing is a lot of them use things like Snapchat AI to talk to as well. And they just seem to be using this kind of technology more and more and more. So I thought it was interesting that they found that this conversational thing was part of how they liked to learn. So that was something that I thought was quite good. I'm just going to talk about some potential drawbacks and as well as some potential benefits before kind of thinking, sort of tying it all together a little bit more. So the first thing I wanted to just highlight is this idea of the empathy gap. So Namisha Kurian and others have talked about this concept that obviously AI is AI. It doesn't understand what it's saying, really. It's not a human, it's not a person. And obviously we're all familiar with horror stories of, headlines like children say they trust robots more than humans, kind of AI is giving all kinds of horrendous advice about things which they really shouldn't be doing. And there is this kind of blind trust often that students have. Now, I thought as my students were older, they would be a little bit more discerning. And as I say, they are quite sophisticated users of AI. But I still found in my survey responses comments like, it has the answer to everything about AI. I tell it about my day. It helps me and gives me advice, which as a parent and as a teacher is kind of slightly setting off little warning bells in my head, because these are not like 8-year-olds, these are 14-year-olds. What I think is good about the Will Play chatbot is that it's kind of distanced from reality. So it's not a real character, it's a character in a play for a start, so they know that Romeo and Juliet isn't real, but it's also cartoonized on top of that. It's not photoreal, it's not kind of got that kind of filmic type quality to it. So there is a little bit of a distancing there. And I think particularly with a play like Romeo and Juliet, which obviously has quite dark content, you've got teenage suicide, you need to be very careful about what kind of AI you're going to be using to sort of get to grips with it. So I think for me, that kind of guardrail that Will Play has is very, very good. And it's something I would be a little bit concerned about with some of the other models that I've seen and kind of played with online. The other thing that I think is a potential drawback, and this is kind of a double-edged sword really, is the kind of gamification of it, linking into kind of motivation theory. So one of the things that came out of my research was that pupils kind of found it fun, and it was a bit like a game, and that made them motivated. But then there's a kind of fine line where that kind of flips when you get overexposure, and actually it's not fun anymore because everything's like that. And they do this sort of thing all the time, and then they get quite critical. So again, some of my gamers were like, well, it's not fun. It's like, it's not, they didn't see it like a game. They saw it more like a sort of an educational piece of software. So there's kind of flip sides of, is it exciting and new, but will it get boring? And actually, is that a potential drawback? It's something that, needs to be thought about carefully. And then the other thing is obviously this concept that we have frequently with AI about the necessity to have a human in the loop. So I think, as I said, Will Play works really well because it has this kind of steered guardrails, this pathway. So there's autonomy and there's kind of response and intelligent response to what the students are saying, but you're still on a particular pathway. And because it's within that, it guards against random hallucinations, inaccuracies, or maybe irrelevant material, which other kind of more general AIs I've seen, or you can kind of even train it yourself to do something with a particular book, sometimes will sneak in. So again, I think that's a really good thing about it. But obviously, if you did this for for Dickens, or you did it for poetry or whatever, you've got that slight danger that it, without a human in the loop seeing what's going on, directing it, and actually seeing what responses might come back, is something to be aware of. Potential benefits then. So I think we need to look at AI as an assistive technology. It is, maybe it's like spell check, or it's like changing your font or your text size. It's like voice to text. It's a way of leveling the playing field. I think it's a way of enabling students who aren't big readers, who don't have a vocabulary that enables them to connect with Shakespeare straight away. It kind of levels the playing field for them. I think it helps them to sort of access what's going on. And I think we could just see it as a helpful assistive technology. It's also a great on-ramp for the language. And there's something lovely about the foreignness of Shakespeare, and I think it's exciting. And there was a fantastic study done up in Liverpool where they put somebody through a CT scanner reading Shakespeare, and their brain was lit up in all different colours, because it's like so interesting, the language, what it does to your brain. And so there is a real place for that, but it does need an on-ramp. At earlier ages or stages of education, I think it can provide a really good way in. And particularly those two apps that I looked at, those two AI tools that offer the original text, but help you to kind of interrogate it, get to grips with what's going on, and do that at the same time, can be a really good on-ramp. And then the most important thing for me, and I think I've kind of alluded to this a little bit, is the interrogation, the conversational element of AI chatbots, which I think can enable a kind of dialogue. It's not a passive way of looking at a text. It's actually engaging you to think critically about reading. So I'll talk a little bit more later about some sort of revision chatbots that I've been involved with. But the nice thing about those is if you kind of train them properly, they will ask questions back to the reader. So you can ask if you're not sure, you can push for a meaning, you can push for a little bit more development, but then the chatbot will talk back to you and say, well, what do you think about that? How would you do this? Do you think this character is doing the right thing? What do you think this word might mean? And there's that kind of that dialogic element, which obviously, we all think dialogic teaching is brilliant in English, and it is, but actually is that something that chatbots can do? Because there's been a lot of research on dialogic teaching with kind of learning second languages, so learning an additional foreign language. So actually, is that something that a chatbot could offer, decoding something like Shakespeare and kind of really getting to grips with more kind of challenging language? And I wonder, I haven't researched this yet, but it's an area definitely to look into, whether this kind of critical reading, this conversational back and forth, this dialogue between the reader and the chatbot kind of around that text. You've got my little picture there of a robot reading Shakespeare to a child, whether that actually might result in improved writing, because there's more of a kind of a mindset of actually, let's challenge this, let's interrogate it, let's kind of think about it a little bit more, rather than it being a static text on a page with no pushback. That actually that interrogation might be something that then feeds into improved writing skills as well. So those are some of the benefits I see. There are obviously lots of kind of downsides as well, but I think used as a suite of activities alongside active approaches, alongside, you know, all the classic things that we've been doing for years, there could be a really great benefit to some of these tools for as an assistive technology, as a way of making Shakespeare's language more accessible, a good on-ramp, and hopefully enabling a bit more dialogue and a bit more critical engagement with some of these texts. So that's what I found. So I'm really hoping that we've got some questions or contributions, or people can share their experiences, because I think there's lots of potential here, and it's a really exciting area to look at. Thank you.
Well, while everybody is thinking, I'll dive in, if you don't mind, Cassie, and ask you a question. So I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about how you got started working with the company. You know, how did you sort of develop that relationship? Because, you know, being an English teacher, so, you know, then coming on to develop your own sort of AI chatbot is pretty amazing. So how did you find them? So how did that work?
So the company I've been doing a little bit of work with is kind of Shakespeare revision tool. So I think the people who kind of came up with it were like looking at exactly the same stuff that I had on my kind of opening slide, that Shakespeare's like a sort of, it's in all the syllabuses. It's kind of, it's a good kind of market area to be focusing your kind of AI on. So, you know, obviously that kind of got them started, but they weren't English specialists and they weren't literature specialists. And I think we initially connected just like randomly on LinkedIn. It was just because I posted something about my dissertation, and it was a really interesting conversation because they showed me their prototype and I was like, well, this is great, but your language that your chatbot is speaking in is way too dense, it's too long, it's not conversational. If you're trying to make this accessible, you need to kind of pitch it, and that's a very easy thing to kind of instantly tweak on, you know, you can easily tweak that on your model. So things like that were the kind of first port of call, but also the idea of talking back to the AI, which was something they hadn't really built in initially. So I was saying, well, actually, we want them to kind of engage. So can you get your model to then ask questions back to the user? So little tweaks like that were kind of ways to kind of feed in experience of being a teacher and actually what kids will do and how they will find this kind of tool. I think sometimes as well, it's very easy to just say to ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, oh, here's like, I know, a Christmas Carol, talk to this person as if you're Scrooge and have a conversation. But often what the AI does is it gives you, and particularly with Shakespeare, is it gives you this awful kind of cod Shakespearean language, which it, because again, it doesn't really understand what it's saying. It's kind of low, forsooth, you know, it's just dreadful. So there is kind of, you need to be very specific in training it with the prompts to make sure that it is something that is going to bridge that gap, and not just be like, it looks cool and it's doing it very quickly, but actually it's not really adding to their understanding or in particularly reflecting what's going on.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting, and another great argument for why we still need humans. Even though we've got these amazing machines, they can't perform to their best unless they've got the expert human alongside them. Thank you. Sam, you've got your hand up. Feel free to unmute and pop on your camera to ask a question if you like. you there, Sam? We'll wait first. Oh, you can always pop it in the chat if you prefer, Sam. If I put you on the spot, I'm sorry. You can always pop your question in the chat and then we'll come to it. Anybody else got a question while we're waiting to see what comes through in the chat? Okay, well, I will put those links in the chat, Cassie. And might you just sort of talk us through them a little
Yeah,
bit? Yeah.
absolutely,
Oh,
absolutely.
right. Hang on. Helen's got her hand up. Let's have a chat with Helen. Helen, what did you want to ask or contribute? I think you should be able to unmute yourself. No, I think I might have turned that on.
It
When
was
you
turned off before. It's now
Oh,
back
I'm
on.
so sorry, Sam. And I'm just like, hello. It's like a seance, isn't it? Except I forgot to sort of switch on the seance machine. I'm so sorry. In that case, Helen, bear with us one moment. Sam, would you ask your question?
Yes. I was interested. I found that really interesting. I've looked myself at like the role of interactive fiction in the secondary English classroom. So I was intrigued to think about how logistically you were running it in the room. Like, were the students using it individually or in pairs or in groups or as a whole class discussion? And did that impact how the students interacted with you and one another rather than just with the tool, if that makes sense?
No, that's a great question. In terms of the translator, so the task that I set up for them was we'd done various bits of work on all kinds of different sections of the play, and some of it I kind of was very teacher led, and we were kind of talking through it, and I would ask them questions, and we kind of come to it ourselves. But I gave them one scene that I particularly wanted them to be considering in preparation for an essay. And I gave it to them printed out clean, not in an annotated copy, not with a glossary. And I was like, right, here you go. You can work in pairs. You can use the tool, see if it helps you to kind of really get to the bottom of what's going on in that scene. So that was kind of quite collaborative and actually probably fairly similar to the way they might use it if they were collaboratively doing MFL homework or French or Spanish, whatever. So that was interesting. In terms of the chatbot, they use that the will play, they use that individually with headphones because there's kind of music and various kind of sound effects and things going on, and like little kind of notifications when things ping up and stuff. It is quite immersive, so that it feels like it's more of a it has that game like quality to it. And we did, like, they would do a segment, so we didn't obviously go through the whole thing right beginning to end, but we'd go, okay, we're going to do the first segment. And this was all after reading the play, watching a film sort of theatrical version, doing kind of drama activities. And it was really there for kind of helping their reading comprehension and consolidation. So they use that kind of individually.
Thank you, Sam. Great question. Helen, I know you were next. Would you still like to ask a question?
Hi, I'm talking from Madrid, and I work in a bilingual, non-selective school. And something that obviously our students struggle with a lot is accessing the Shakespearean language. So I love the idea of making it gamey for them. But as a teacher, how can you track what students are doing? Because of course, the worry is always they'll just start chatting to each other and messing about and perhaps not doing what you hope they're going to do. Is there a way for teachers to see on their screen or to log in as a teacher to see what the whole class is doing?
So it kind of slightly probably depends on the software that you have in your school. So I know, if you're in particular schools like Google schools, you can kind of see what's on everybody's screen and stuff, and that would slightly depend on your setup, I guess. I mean, something I found with the translation task, I just gave them very tight time controls, which kind of had them sort of slightly panicking, so they weren't kind of distracted. But there is obviously, whenever you're using tablets or laptops, there is the potential for distraction. With the kind of the will play, because they were headphones on, they were really immersed in it. And I mean, obviously, as a teacher, I'll just stand at the back and make sure I can see everybody's screens and make sure they're not doing other things and playing Minecraft or doing whatever. But they did get very immersed in that. And because you have to talk, you have to keep talking to keep it going. It was the kind of level of engagement was really high because you had to, otherwise it would just, you wouldn't get to the end of it. So you did have to interact all the time, and you did have to kind of, if you said something slightly weird, because they tested it and they pushed it and they thought, oh, I'll just say something random, it would push you back on track. So in the end, they stopped doing that because it didn't actually help them to progress.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. A great question. Oh, Peter, is that a hand up? Yes. Hello.
Hello, sorry, I couldn't raise my hand virtually and I couldn't type in the chat, so I thought you'd understand if I stuck my hand in the camera there. My background is more from AI than English teaching, let me say at the start. I'm interested though in the research about dialogue in teaching, because I'm wondering there might be certain things you want to cover or certain things you want students to discuss, but you kind of don't want to push it at them. And if they ask questions, is it possible, or can any of these systems sort of lead around to the point so you could come from different directions, but it will bring them to the things, the main points you want to discuss without being too prescriptive? And if there's something like that, it's interesting. If there's not something like that, there probably should be, and we could talk about it later.
Yeah, I think the questioning element is a really interesting one. So I won't kind of bore everybody with my dissertation now, but I did a whole section on kind of dialogic learning in English and actually how that could be related to chatbots. And I think there's been some really great research done on it with second language learning. So I can share that if you're interested. I can share some of the articles. There's been a lot done in China and Hong Kong and Singapore. They're really on it there. And I kind of drew quite heavily from some of their learning. But what was interesting from that research in terms of like students with SEND, which was something I was very interested in, was that actually in terms of dialogic learning, although it was beneficial to do something that was machine-led, it was more beneficial to have a human, which I thought was very interesting, because with all the other things I looked at, and particularly with my own study, they really liked the AI. But even in my setting, the students within the cohort who had processing or reading issues or literacy issues preferred the dialogue with a human being than the one with the computer. And I wonder whether there's something about facial expression, tone, emphasis, those kind of social cues that helps when reading is not something you find easy.
Okay, thank you for that. Sorry, I'm struggling to unmute myself, but yeah, it'd be interesting to look at that literature. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That was a great question. If you want me to put you in touch with Cassie after, you can just drop me a note on hello@englishassociation.ac.uk, and then I can link you up. Oh, Sam popped a question in the chat. Thank you, Sam. Right, I'll read that out for you if that's okay. Are there any published accounts of how will play has been used in the classroom? Do you know, Cassie, either by you or by others? And then also a link to an article. Thank you very much, Sam.
So there's a really good podcast, which actually Becky's going to share with you with some of my links later, that the two of the team, the academic team behind Will Play, did about the project and some of the research they've done in classrooms and some of the kind of user response to it. So that will be on the links that Becky shares in a minute, which is worth listening to. It's one of those things that kind of it came second in the competition. It was really great, and then it's just sitting there. You can access it through BBC Bitesize, and obviously it's still on the host website as well. And I think as ever with these things, they'd love to do more or do other plays, but it's all down to funding. So I'm not aware of any academic accounts of it apart from the kind of creators and their own usage of it and their own responses to that on the podcast, which is why, I have written about it quite extensively if you're interested, but I'm very happy to share more of that if you want.
Thank you, Cassie, and thank you, Sam, for another great question. Any more questions? Well, in that case, we've got a few minutes left. I'll pop those links in the chat, and then if there's anything you want to highlight particularly about them, Cassie, you can. There we go.
Great. So yeah, the first one is just obviously a link to the Shakespeare translator, and the second one, much ado about AI, is the creator of that translator and his kind of rationale for what he's doing and why he wanted to do it the way he did. Then you've got a link to Will Play itself, so you can have, and it is really fun. So do play around with that. Do use it with your students, and then the podcast that I mentioned is there as well. I have a lot more bump on kind of this kind of area. So if anybody wants like loads and loads of bibliographical reading, then I'm very happy to share that. If you get in touch with Becky, that's great.
Thank you very much, Cassie. I will send around these links to you all again when I send you the recording of tonight's session, so don't worry too much about squirreling them away for now. I'll make sure that you all have them. We do have a couple more minutes if anybody has any questions. Yeah, I second you, Rose. Yeah, that was really interesting. Yeah, thank you.
I would have one more if no one else. I mean, I'm aware I'm dominating things a bit, but have you used like more run-of-the-mill, let's say, AI tools like ChatGPT or any of the competitors in your lessons at all, or just tried using that as opposed to these sort of more custom-built AI?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's been some great stuff this week. Even the National Literacy Trust has been sharing revision tools for students and teachers and parents, which has been really great. I mean, something I've used ChatGPT to help students with transactional writing, so because it's boring and soulless. Sorry, that's my judgment. But if you want to say write a classic report or a review or a speech, it's very good at the generic. And actually for students, particularly students who are middle, lower ability, they find that really helpful because it kind of goes, oh, that's what it looks like. These are the conventions. Oh, okay. And it'll do it really quickly. So I do use that with my GCSE students. I do like Notebook LM for the kind of podcast feature. So that's really helpful. Again, I find it super helpful with SEND students. So I have a number of my A-level students who are dyslexic. And if you give them a critical article about the Oedipus complex in Hamlet or something, they will make really heavy weather of it. But if you ask Notebook LM to do a little podcast, they all love a podcast, even though I've noticed that the male voice talks over the female voice quite a lot, which I find irritating, but there we are. They find that a really helpful way to access the same material. So I'll create one and then I'll download it to share it with them, because I think, again, that's a post-18 user model. And again, actually, some of my GCSE students like reading sort of non-fiction text. They quite like a summary of that, and they like the podcast feature. So I've used that as well, which is really helpful.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cassie. Lots to go on there. Thank you very much. We could probably squeeze in one more question if anybody has one. Oh, Ms. Langford asks, remind you of the name of the podcast resource. Yes, I will do that. I will make sure that you have all that information when I send around the recording. No problem. Okay, in that case, I will draw us to a close and just thank Cassie so much for sharing all your expertise and work with us. I know you've condensed into, a tight 30 minutes, a lot of work. So thank you very much for doing that. And thank you to all of you for joining us. It's a real pleasure to see you all and chat with you. I apologise again for our Zoom bomber. It's a perennial problem with Zoom, but I do apologise because I know it's upsetting and not very pleasant. So thank you very much again for being with us, and I hope to see you again at another of our events. Thank you.